Is 3D printing the future of construction? Join us as we discuss this and more on 3D Print the Future with your host, Frank Awesome.
There is currently a vicious crisis concerning affordable housing in Canada. While experts say we shouldn't spend more than 30% of our income on housing, there are thousands of struggling Canadians spending more than half their income on rent. What makes this issue even worse is that its effect doesn't end at housing. For those who live off minimum wage, it becomes almost impossible to maintain their budget as so much of their income is going towards rent. This can lead to high levels of consumer debt, poor credit, and even homelessness. The housing crisis is one of many issues that we, as people of Earth, need to address so we can better ourselves and thrive as a community of communities. With sensible and affordable housing solutions in place, we can all begin to more diligently tackle the other issues from a place of safety and comfort. You know, homelessness is not as well understood as we might like to imagine, especially for those who have never been personally affected by it. But we're in luck. Today, I have a conversation with someone who's been there, managed to save himself, and now makes every effort for those less fortunate. Joining us from Brockville, Ontario, he's a journalist for Invisible People TV, executive director with Tiny Home Alliance Canada, a council member for the City of Brockville, and he has won multiple awards for his work, including the Top 40 Under 40 Young Professionals Award twice. He's involved in a large number of philanthropic adventures, all geared towards the housing crisis, helping youth, and the homeless community. So please welcome to the show, Leigh Zachary Bursey.
How are you today?
I'm great. Thank you for asking.
We're really excited to have you on because it's becoming a lot clearer to me that 3D printing technology, while a lot of people are excited about what it can do or up in arms about what it couldn't possibly do and all this wonderful stuff, more and more of the conversations I have are tuned towards the homelessness situation, the housing crisis, housing veterans, and now another sort of leak has sort of sprung in there, and that's the youth element of that. Tell me a little bit, maybe where you come from and how you get to a point where you're literally working with half a dozen or more places that are working in different aspects of homelessness and youth services and things like that. Tell me about that.
Well, first things first, I'll say a shout out to Terry Lee Kelford. I understand she was the person that you may have been speaking with not too long ago. She's
Tara
outstanding.
Lee. Yeah, she's episode 9 and you're episode 10.
Oh, fantastic. Well, she's an incredible human and a valued colleague of mine.
She's awesome.
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, someone who dedicates their life to this without really much financial gain. It's merely just that they care. And we need more people who just care.
Mm-hmm.
That said, just caring is also debilitating financially, which is exactly why I'm probably involved with multiple different part-time roles. To give you some context myself, I'm a 33-year-old, 3-term Brockville City Councillor. I have done everything from working on provincial and national campaigns politically with different parties, all the way to, I think I was involved with the Obama campaign, actually, in 2012, briefly, in North Carolina as part of a Canadian contingency. I love politics. I eat, sleep, and breathe it. But the problem I always had with politics as a young person who wanted to make a difference, social justice warrior, is filing a report in those type of circles oftentimes is not as advantageous as actually being on the ground and doing things. We have to run more than campaigns and make promises. We actually have to, help people. My mother and I were homeless episodically at different points, probably about 18 years ago. There's still people who are in my life, in my world, who that might surprise, because the challenge when anything is domestic is it's embarrassing for many people. It can be very traumatic and very challenging. Especially for a single mother. Oftentimes she feels as though that, has played on her subconscious as though she failed me somehow. I think these are normal feelings of futility. And of course, there's also the fact that we live in a small town, and, my late stepfather, who I have, at this point, very few ill feelings for, he kickstarted a huge part of my life almost accidentally, I suppose, an unintended consequence. He just, I guess, on physical, mental, personal, emotional level, wasn't able to be all the things that I think he may have intended to be at one point. Whatever the case, it thrust us out into some pretty desperate and unfortunate circumstances, and living in public parks and campgrounds and hotel rooms, and between family members, sleeping in our van at different points. And, it was a very difficult narrative that we definitely downplayed. And to be fair, I downplayed it probably until I'm going to say 2012, 2013, I was already a city councillor. I've had my own issues, no doubt, and I think that comes from just a variety of different challenging backgrounds as a survivor of poverty. My family has struggled with certain mental health components and with certain necessary supports, and it's blurred the lines for me too, in understanding my own vulnerability and making some poor decisions along the way. But at this point, I'm confident in saying, I think a lot of the reason why I'm involved in this sector or these conjoined sectors of housing and homelessness issues is merely because I said yes and was willing to be educated and willing to speak up, and also just willing to show up. And showing up sometimes came at a cost and became exhausting at different points, but as more often than not been well worth it. In that I can honestly say I've gotten an education a lot of other people haven't, and I really am proud to be a caveat for these different discussions.
Speaking to that actually, and the way you grew up, I kind of I really can relate to that just because I grew up in a really poor family as well. I estranged myself from my entire bloodline when I was 13 years old. I left home, told the family that I was going to cadet camp and I wouldn't be back for 6 weeks. They believed me out of hand. They didn't that this was a family who didn't care about each other whatsoever. Like really, just couldn't care less. And I willingly put myself on the streets. And I think yeah, I don't want to speak to my story very, very much, but I wanted to point that out because I think that there are some people who are in that situation where they kind of, I hesitate to say want to, but it's a place in their life where they're kind of at right now. And um, for me, it was a good thing. It helped me do what you're discussing. I learned a lot about the world around me. I was able to sort of formulate my own scientific theories about the world because without the influence of somebody else's experience, I didn't have parents or a family kind of lording over me, indoctrinating me into whatever beliefs or belief systems that they happen to hold dear. So then I grew up either poor because they're poor, or I grew up rich because they're rich, or I grew up with a business because they have a business. They really don't have a choice. So people in our situations, I think we do become a lot more, a little more than street smart. And that's just sort of life smart, and critical thinking becomes like breathing. It's a way of life, and it makes us very confused about what other people do. And so you guys are really investigating this sort of stuff with this group called Invisible People TV.
Yeah, so this is a really cool thing that I'm
It
proud of. I
is.
don't really get to talk enough about. Mark Horvath is the founder of this organization, and he's doing so, I still think, almost at a loss to himself, quite frankly. He's a very philanthropic guy. He's been very open. I think he celebrated 25 years of sobriety in the last week or so. I'm incredibly proud of him, but he went from being a producer for like Married with Children and Wheel of Fortune and working in Hollywood, in television, to literally homeless on Skid Row, and managed to pull himself out of it, but not without the help of not just shelter supports and social services, but good people who invested in time and energy in it. And in the return, I think he spent his life as a filmmaker capturing those stories, whether it's telling them through a video or telling them even just through snapshots in an interview. He's publishing incredible content that's reaching sometimes 600,000 subscribers in a month, and it's been spectacular. And quite frankly, I think it could be bigger. It's just a matter of the fact that to some degree, it's still a very much small operation in terms of how many people are there as working components. I met him a number of years ago at the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness conference. I'm going to say probably Vancouver. And we hit it off. And, he's been to my neck of the woods for lunch. And, recently, I guess last year, he finally said, he's like, I could probably use a few extra Canadian correspondents. Your writing is significant. And in the process, I've been able to not just tell, personal stories that are important to me about some rough sleepers or previously rough sleepers that I've worked with, but also take a analytical policy lens. And the writing has been seen by so many people that it's been just incredibly advantageous for me as a young a young journalist and a storyteller. But it's also been incredible in that how many people actually reach out to me and share these articles, and the education I get is just spectacular. I'm incredibly proud of the work he does, and I know COVID kicked the crap out of it. There's no doubt, because a lot of South by Southwest and a lot of different fundraising organizations and big festivals were seeming willing to partner. But at the same time, while it may have slowed down the overall financial viability, which means the expansion is staggered, I will say that it also, COVID has been phenomenal in opening the door for conversation around homelessness, because sadly, opportunity knocks in this particular sector when you see people struggling through a crisis.
We really see the same thing. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. Before the crisis, we had only been my company, 3D Printed Homes Corporation, has only been kind of like in planning stages right up to the beginning of this year. In the beginning of this year, we were looking at, okay, we've got some money coming. It wasn't written in stone. We knew it was coming. We didn't know when. So we're kind of transitioning, just doing that transition between planning and paperwork to starting to really go and spend some real money. And COVID hits. So I'm a graphic designer and I have 22 years in the service industry. So I was working with restaurants. I lost all of my business there. We were no longer able to have meetings. We were invited to an Edmonton conference to speak. We were invited to a Saskatchewan conference to speak. Those got canceled. So we spent literally probably 3, maybe 4 months solid back to the drawing board saying, okay, how are we going to do this? And the answer came stronger and stronger that, well, how do we not take advantage of this whole thing with COVID? And well, look, our story is the same. Our goal hasn't changed. And we realized that we could use this COVID with the increased awareness of people, the increased eyes on the internet. So you kind of pick your thing. And we said, well, we can use this whole heightened awareness that COVID has brought, and the fact that now we're going to have more people homeless, as we see in the news, how landlords are starting to crack down on their renters, like, oh, they're going to kick all the renters out. Never mind the problems that they're going to cause for themselves doing that. Forget about that. You're going to have the homeless problem isn't going to decrease now. It's actually going to increase. So we need a big solution for this. And the solution isn't go building brick and mortar wooden plank tiny homes. They are great. They look awesome. These little villages they're building are awesome. But the problem with them is they're not cheaper and they're not faster. It still takes 1.5 years to put up a village, and it still costs $1.5 million.
I'll jump in there and just say, recently, for instance, my MVP, Steve Clark, is Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing here in Ontario, and Adam Vaughan, who is Parliamentary Secretary for the federal minister, who's more or less tasked with, managing the national housing strategy. They were in Kingston announcing something in the neighborhood of, my numbers might be off a little bit here, somewhere between $625,000 and $685,000 that is going into rent-geared income apartments, which by the end of it are going to probably build 5 or 6. Meanwhile, there's a homeless encampment in Kingston that currently has 40 people, where I'd say any type of conventional tiny home, whether it be the old-fashioned bricks and mortar, 30 to 50,000, 80,000 on the very high end here in Ontario, to build that versus a more innovative model like your own would go substantially further if they had $625,000 to work with, especially considering there are already a lot of backyards with a lot of sympathetic people who would love to help. But it's very difficult to create anything sustainable just because the legislative gridlock is still so significant. So I agree with you, and I know we all shy away from the term opportunity when we're talking about a health crisis. I get that, and I don't by any means say that this is advantageous. What we're saying, if anything, is that we've been beating our heads off the wall talking about these things for so long, and it seems like only now, for a lot of folks at least, that people are listening or aware. And I think that that's interesting because it's not that they're not aware that the issue is there. They're surprised by the stopgaps that were already in place to prevent it from being solved. I look at the mom and pop landlords in some of our smaller communities, and some of our larger as well, but some of those more independently owned, a lot of these folks are actually the neighbors of the tenants that may end up on the eviction block. And I get it. I mean, I totally understand that they've got to pay their mortgages, keep their upkeep in place, and there's an expectation. I think the challenge I have is that we don't have a federal government, national residential rent relief program. We don't. We depend on provinces to manage this, and who are already managing healthcare, which is, if no one's noticed, expensive, specifically during a health crisis. And I look to it and I think to myself that, the worst thing that I could see happening, and I'm perfectly okay with overshooting and being totally wrong, would be similar to post 2008. Which was that we had the financialization and the commoditization of housing, where people were, major companies were investing in distressed assets as investment properties to create condominium towers. And no shot to condominium towers or their owners, but the difference here is I want to keep those local landlords local, because they're the ones who are going to have the attachments to the community. I work for a private sector landlord who's been incredibly patient with folks who sometimes might not even deserve that patience.
They're
And I
not
think a
all
lot
like
of those,
that though,
no,
Lee.
no, of course,
There's a lot of corrupt, for lack of a better word, just
no doubt.
people out there.
But there's corrupt people in every world. I guess where I'm coming from is that the last thing I want to do is take away the name and the face that I can hold accountable.
That's fair.
And instead it just becomes a larger entity that it's almost impossible to ever have that interpersonal exchange with and create that opportunity for a relationship. So for me, I think to myself that, I don't want to see further, financialization of the housing sector, where now we're going to have, property values. Like we saw a tiny home listed in Toronto not long ago for $1 million. You realize it's not that tiny home, it's the property attached to it. And it's speculative because they assume the shortage is there, so people will pay what the market can bear. That's pricing people out of an opportunity. And it's also not a real fair, accurate, depiction of what a tiny home or a tiny home community looks like, which is an incredibly economical way to house somebody.
Tiny home, the term tiny home now, I think it's starting to bear a little more definition, because tiny homes have been around since the war.
Yes, exactly.
Toronto has blocks and blocks and blocks of tiny homes that are just stuck right together, that are 2 stories, but they're 10 feet across or 20. They're really small. Like their yards are like literally 6 by 6 foot square. And these are tiny homes. They were considered tiny homes. So the term tiny home, I think, almost needs to change, although I couldn't even tell you what I might change that to.
It's the TLC show that's changed everything. They've made it trendy, made it hip. The secondary suite, the granny suite, micro suites.
But that's where it's at, though. I mean, it should be hip. It should be trendy.
Going back to Bell Park specifically, those folks in Kingston, I mean, the consensus there is they don't want to go into a Roach Motel. They don't want to go into a cooling center shelter system, which is a very, very expensive way not to house anyone.
Right.
They don't want to live on top of each other because some of them have different behavioral issues and some just fell through the cracks economically. But they want to be able to have their own autonomy. And for some, the idea of something major and big to take care of is it's almost adverse for them to consider, which is interesting because there was a recent editorial caught a lot of attention nationally about tiny homes not being a way to end homelessness, because Canada's Housing First initiative should be focused on creating opportunity for people to live in normal housing, contemporary housing as an option. And I think to myself, and for some, that if you're looking about creating options for people, maybe assuming that they all want, everyone who might be in need might want something that's bigger than we can maintain is not necessary, specifically when you're talking about a rough sleeper who doesn't have a tremendous level of personal asset and maybe struggling with certain aspects of their life and trying to focus on getting themselves on track and getting through some of the other challenges and hurdles that have been put in front of them. Maybe sometimes a very small space to call their own is enough to take ownership. And, Tiny Home Alliance Canada has been running that for, that type of narrative is a huge part of what we talk about, and it's the idea that not only if you want a luxury, sure, we support your ability to, on a personal autonomy level, we support your ability to have whatever type of house you so wish. But I think it's unfortunate how many times the legislative backdrop has created this area where the idea that contemporary housing is the only option and somehow a tiny home is undesirable, or this fabricated mythos that every neighborhood that includes a tiny home secondary suite, that it will somehow affect adjacent property values, when there's just absolutely nothing to back up that claim. Or people refer to them as some type of gentrified trailer park. I don't know how fair that is either. I mean, more importantly, the gentrification in this particular field, tiny homes, makes sense, because I would much rather live across from a beautiful state-of-the-art micro suite house than something that was made famous, and without talking crass or putting anyone down. I'm happy someone has a place to go, but growing up with the era of the trailer park boys, sure, okay, maybe I can appreciate how this looks unattractive to someone who's a homeowner locally. But I also think that, many times we're just missing the boat, because what we've assumed is we've sort of projected our own personal views of what a home should be in its size into a sector and into a planning legislation to maximize some level of tax revenue.
Mhm.
And what we've done is we've not made people choose between an apartment or a major home. What we've done is we've just priced people out of both. And now we're seeing all these folks who fall through the cracks. And I think that's just so unfortunate, because the answer is, as you've said, been around since well before you or I were sitting here talking about it.
Mhm.
But somehow that type of mentality is adverse to it still exists. How many people who are on social housing waiting lists because the average rent in their municipality is $1,200 to $1,800?
You hit on a lot of points that are kind of close to what we're sort of looking at, and the political agenda is something I think that a lot of other 3D construction companies aren't at least aren't vocal about looking at. We actually have two people out in Ontario that are advocates for us, for our company specifically, and for 3D printing construction abstractly. So we are in front of Congress. We are actually we're writing, trying to write bills. We're trying to bring changes to the programs and how grants are given to industries that specifically are poised to sort of revolutionize things and help social economic development within the country. And of course, we advocate for that because we fall squarely into that category. It's our whole mandate. It's the whole reason we draw breath every day. Now, and because of that, though, I'm really become way against subsidies of any kind. So what you get is you get a company that sells, that are going to build those apartments. They're going to build those apartments for a regular price. They're not going to give a discount. They're not giving any kind of subsidy to the city or whatever, whoever has to pay for that. So the city then owns that property. Great. They paid full price for it. And then they're going to put a bunch of renters in there, use tax dollars to then subsidize the rents. But the rents that are being paid out to the owners are still $1,500 a month, $2,000 a month, even if the tenant is only paying $1,000 a month, which is still way too freaking high. And the answer to that is to make the politicians feel within themselves that what we're doing benefits them and their career. And you have to do it again, another thing you touched on, which is aesthetics. We have to make them look really nice, because people will worry less about how they function if they just look really nice. If I wear a suit to a meeting, I'll get a lot more attention than if I wear my pajamas and t-shirt like I would much rather wear. Not a different person. So aesthetics is a huge thing, right? No, and you probably go through that. You have to decide, should I wear a sleeved shirt today or shouldn't I?
So I've put on the collar with a short sleeve that says official, but still myself.
Official, but still messed up. Oh, yourself. Official, but still messed up. And then so aesthetics, right? You got to make them look really, really nice. And then you've got to make it affordable. And we're not talking about affordable housing. Ed will tell you this, our CEO. We are making housing affordable, right? So affordable housing, that's a subsidy thing. It's housing that costs the same amount of money, so it's affordable housing.
Now I'm my turn to educate for a second.
Go for it.
You got to separate affordable housing from nonprofit housing.
Well, we do it from housing affordability and affordable housing. We see those two things as two different things.
Sure, and that's fair. But just to kick in here, affordable home ownership does not necessarily include subsidy. It includes below market rate housing, which is similar to what you were just discussing. So my ability to purchase or maintain a home at a below market share would be considered an affordable home ownership or affordable housing opportunity, versus the nonprofit piece, which is where an actual subsidy comes into play. Both have their advantages.
Yeah.
And I could talk all day and would never demonize either or. What I'm saying is it's nice to have choice.
Well, now could we not have to worry about, like, if we don't, the problem for me is that we need that at all. So to me, that's where the kind of the roots lie. You got to pull out the roots if you want the weed to die. And then that's kind of what we got to do. We got to pull out those roots. We got to stop with this perspective that we need to subsidize things, or, we need to have things at, lower. If we can put things at low market values like that to begin with, the only thing in the way of that is kind of politics. It's policy and stuff that gets in the way of all that.
Funny, because what you're saying, I agree with, but the way you're saying it would speak very much to the right-wing libertarian.
Oh, really?
Who would also agree they don't want to subsidize anything, right?
I'm not a politician at all. I don't even like politics. I'm not into politics, but
I'm a politician who also doesn't like politics. a lot of the time. And I think it's cool. This is a good conversation. But the problem I have is that when we say we don't want to subsidize anything, it also means that for those who want their taxes lowered, sometimes at the at the benefit of the few when it comes to the actual devastation of those who very much need the help. The challenge I have with that conundrum is that they're also the same ones who would say that politics has created the certain frameworks that makes it unattractive to be a landlord because now we can't evict people. And then at the beginning of the conversation, we were talking about how evicting people into homelessness is like a devastating concept. Those same folks who don't want to subsidize something are the same ones advocating for that opportunity to evict without necessarily the same reason or checks and balances. I think my concern is that what we're talking here to some degree is that there's no rent caps in some places. So you have private sector places or private sector industries, which I'm a big believer and supporter in because I understand that they serve the greater good of my community too. I need employers, I need tax base, all those things are necessary. But if that's somehow how we've managed to get the $2,000 a month for a bachelor apartment in some larger cities, which is staggering and foolish. And then by saying we don't want to subsidize things is also why we hold true on welfare rates being so low that there's no way that someone can have their own apartment, and instead they have to go and say, well, I've got 300 left to live on and 200 here for my personal needs, and it would be easier for me to go and get 4 roommates and for us to rent a 3-bedroom apartment where someone's sleeping in the living room. Then all of a sudden you've got all these folks who are going through transient, this is where all the problems come is someone wants their own autonomy and they're stuck in this process where they have no choice but to deal with some folks who might be doing or living a different life than they had intended.
I am stuck in that process, believe it or not. I have over the last since I left home, and even before that, my family had always they were very poor. Dad couldn't hold on to a job. Mom was uneducated. We moved once, maybe twice a year, even when I was a kid, and that's followed me all through life. I've been in one single place for I was almost 2 years. That's the longest I've ever lived in one place, and not even 2 years. And even now, I've this last year I moved four times. Yeah, 4 times. Once within Calgary, once to BC, once back from BC, and then again through Calgary, and then in January I moved again. You need so much extra money. You need so much over and above your just living your life in order to secure that. That if you can't get to that point, you kind of get stuck in limbo. And in some cases, fall off the boat entirely, and now you're homeless. It's impossible in some cases for a homeless person to just by themselves just go ahead and say, a lot of people say, well, why don't they get a job? Why don't you do this? Why are they begging on the streets? Well, you go put yourself in that person's shoes. You're dirty. You smell bad. You're not in a great mood. How do you pretend to be happy and positive and go tell a guy who you're asking, can I have a job? He says, why? And you're like, are you supposed to answer because I just really want to work? I love your company. You're like, no, I want to eat. I want to survive. It becomes impossible. And that's what you're talking about. We've created this sort of paradigm where we in privileged situations complain about the people without privilege and wonder, oh, why can't they do what we're doing? There's that gap. There's a spot where you're climbing the ladder and there's a 10-foot break. Maybe you could scrabble to the top. Some people can grab the lip and get over top. Sometimes we fall back, like myself and you apparently a couple of times.
Right.
There are other people that don't have the strength, don't have the strength of will or the absolute just dogged persistence that I'm known for, that it takes to do that, to be able to sort of
Kudos to you because you're right. It's not that simple. And for some who have been
very
able
hard.
to do it, I'm always so impressed and so incredibly proud of you. But I'm working currently, doing some seasonal work at a local youth shelter in Ottawa. And we have our 1 or 2 who are very, very image conscious. And kudos to them because they go out, they look like $1,000,000. Oftentimes they tell us they got a job, but it's difficult to keep because they don't necessarily have a stable place. We have a couple who haven't. We've dealt with youth who've had apartments who feel incredibly unsafe in their apartments because it's too big and too much for them to manage, and they sometimes still come to ask if they could sleep in our space. That's something I never pictured for myself. But for those who are really struggling, a lot of people blame the addict for the addiction. And a lot of people blame somebody for the circumstances. And there's no doubt that there's, behavioral issues. There are challenges. There are some folks who are still struggling with their accountability. There's no doubt about that. But I challenge you to say you find that everywhere. Like, I look at this particular place and I realize I'm grateful for that shelter because it creates a level of security for those youth. And I've gotten to know them, and I love and adore them.
Right.
The other day I spent my breakfast yesterday morning, before you and I were talking, I was talking to them about, who's better, Tupac or Biggie. Totally relatable. I can enjoy this conversation. I said they're my peers. But, do I understand how, that person that I'm enjoying this breakfast with might end up making some poor decisions today? Yes, I do.
For sure. I think you're really touching on something that's been in the back of my mind, and that's programs. So you can't just, and I want to really kind of get back to 3D printed construction, specifically, tiny home village construction for the purpose of housing qualified individuals. And I really want to stress that once 3D PHC takes off and I have the ability to then go and purchase my own land, create my own side company, I've been working on a program that does this. You first do what invisible people are doing. You visit your community, and you do this for a year or more, and you really start getting to know the people, and people will start sort of, standing out from the crowd and pick a few qualified people. And what you do is you build a little village, 6, maybe a dozen homes that I own. I own the land. I own everything about it. And you give these people education on site, not regular education, but health, living, all that wonderful stuff, and you provide them with a home that they then have to at some point be responsible for paying the rent and paying the bills. So then you monitor this. This person, they're in a program, they're getting counseling all the time, they're getting visits. We're working with them. We're not monitoring so much as working with them and helping them through their things. And you have sort of a statute of limitations. So I'd say I picked 7 years. After 7 years, if they've gone through this program with very few hiccups or none at all, which would kind of be my preference, they've paid their bill every month. They've gone to their job every day. It looks like they've got it under control, and they've paid all this money. Now, where's that money going to? It's coming back to me because I'm the landlord. Now I'm putting all that money back into a high interest savings account so that when they're ready, they've officially bought that house from me. So now I'm going to go ahead and sell it back to them. Make it real easy. They don't have to go to the market. They don't have to look for a buyer. I just give them their money back minus whatever 10% or, because I've made the interest off that. I don't know how the money's going to work. I need somebody for that. But, so then you give that back to them. So now what they've done is they've spent 7 years not proving to us that they can do it. They've spent 7 years proving to themselves that they could do it.
Definitely. They build
muscle
equity.
memory. So they've done it. They've been doing it.
Mm-hmm.
To the point where, and now we don't just let them go into the world. Hi, bye, have fun going to rent $1,000 a month apartment with no money now. Have a good time. Thanks for the house. No, they go out with 30 grand in their pocket to start their lives, and they continue getting help from us. They get help from us to find a place. If they want to buy a house, they get help from us to do that. This is a program that lasts a lifetime for this person. Some people may never need the help again, but we're there if they need it. So we have to come in and do these things at no profit to us, because people aren't a commodity. People shouldn't be a product, especially if they're in a demographic that needs help, whether it's the Black community, cancer survivors, child slavery, or homelessness, veterans. All those things need to be helped. And we're not going to do it even with awareness. We're going to do it with physical action. We're going to do it with people go out there and start helping. Any program that I do with that is going to be a nonprofit.
I'll be the first one to say, though, I mean, if someone wants to go out and be rewarded for their efforts, I'm fine with that too, as long as they can adapt at least some of your mantras. I'm willing to work with anyone, but I love a lot of the things you're saying here. I mean, as colorful as some of it might be, as challenging as some of that conversation might be, the fact is, no doubt your heart's in the right place. And for me, I go, great, let's cultivate that. I want more people like that. But at the same time, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities said a number of years ago, and I'm sure the number has changed, but every dollar spent on housing is worth $1.43 in gross domestic product. That's literally a significant turnaround on investment, in terms of building economies. You want to put people back to work post-recession, which, let's be real, it's what we're in. Build homes. You want to talk about the strengths during the Harper administration, which is, not necessarily my favorite conversation, but let's just give it a try for a second and say that the homeowners retrofit program that they put in place, where there was a tax subsidy for people to renovate their spaces, was remarkably significant. And it not only was a significant, as a tax subsidy that, as a taxpayer we pay for, granted, but at the same time, it was a massive economic boom for a lot of local businesses that deal in things such as lumber and carpeting and ventilation systems. And some of these programs, when they come out and say, okay, today we're doing, the Ontario government is going to retrofit sinks in community housing, that could be a massive boom for not just your local Home Depot and Home Hardware, which also employ people in your community, in many cases employ some of the same people who might be the user groups, matter of fact, of some of these circumstances. But on top of that, for the local, the local entrepreneur who's trying to, create and craft something specific, that's phenomenal. So when you put that in perspective, if we can just tinge that a little bit, because who is the one who benefited in that program? People who already own the home. However, what that does demonstrate and illustrate, I think quite clearly, is that when we are willing to subsidize, I know your favorite word, or we're willing to invest in some aspect of creating spaces that are beautiful, that are hospitable, that are safe, that are secure, and that are healthy, it's quite spectacular what that can do for a local economy,
Really is.
For a local builder, for a local architect, for a local entrepreneur. All of which many times, should the economy fall tits up as it has for so many, are the people who are also going to be needing the support. So in that case, you're an example of this. Someone who's been able to lift themselves out of their circumstance. I like to think I am too, to some degree, but in a different world. And so what do? We do everything we can to get back. And in this case, it also means creating something. So here we are.
It also gives you the impression that you got to help now, doesn't it? I mean, I wasn't helping anybody by most of my life. Everything I ever did was pretty much just for myself to survive. A few of my psychologists will tell you that's one of my greatest traits, is that I'm a survivor.
It's a resilient friend. Soberly is super helpful.
Yeah. And you want to, and I never really helped anybody but myself all my life. And then I got to a point, after, in my 40s, when 3D printing came out. And again, I was just doing it for myself. Oh, I can start a business, so I can make money 3D printing. Great, great, great. I saw Appicore in 2014 print a house on the ground in the winter in Russia in less than 48 hours, and was just mind blown. But the funny thing that happened at that moment was, instead of thinking, how can I make money from this? My very first thought when I saw that was, we can solve homelessness. Literally, my first thought and right away, that's where the light bulb went up. Wait a minute. That's my thing. That's my calling. This is what I can do to help anybody besides myself in life in a real way. I mean, helping a friend move, that's different. We have the potential to help countless millions of people with this sort of technology. And that comes to building houses. And now we're going to build tiny houses in yards to help families, and all this stuff is going to help mitigate homelessness. So how many people become homeless because they just couldn't live with their family anymore? Well, what if they could have a little granny suite in the backyard, where now there's some separation, and suddenly you're even holding families together on a personal and emotional level with a building?
Well, let's talk about separation for a second, because I think that's what's key here. That's what separates this conversation from a high-rise or a nonprofit housing, but actually creating the community. What I love, and going back to Bell's Park once again, Bell Park just happens to be close by, and it's something that I've been a mild activist and advocate and more or less a listener and observer, but it's my closest significant tent city. And I think to myself, my goodness, you put 8 or 9 tiny homes that are, in a semicircle type direction, where they kind of face each other, even though they're obviously off to their own space. Well, wouldn't that remove a lot of what happens in some communities when you're dealing with people who have significant behavioral or psychological issues that can sometimes make it challenging to live next door to, when you're in an apartment complex and you're sharing that hallway and corridor? But at the same time, what we have known for some of those people specifically in this particular community is their health has improved in a tent city. And people go, how? How does your health improve?
Community.
And when you're living outside. And the reason why is because, well, maybe you've had trouble with authority. Maybe you have trouble with particular conventional circumstance. Maybe you might have certain toxic traits that you're working on and trying to build yourself up and challenge. But at the same time, these things take time, and we're human. However, if you haven't seen Steve come out of his tent in 3 days, you're going to go check on him. And the cool part about these particular communities, I think of a lot of the Northern Ontario Indigenous communities where you have people who are intergenerational living on top of each other almost in these small spaces. Wouldn't it be neat if that same plot of land had 5 houses where if grandma, for instance, ended up with symptoms that could be COVID related, or worse yet, if I do, grandma can isolate or I can isolate to prevent that from happening without having to lose the characteristics of your community, lose the family integration aspect, lose the intergenerational support systems. But at the same time, if there's somebody who has significant problems when it comes to interacting with everyone else, you can keep an eye on that person, but they can still have their autonomy, which is missing in so many spaces and definitely in shelters. Shelters, like I said, I work at one and I believe in what they serve as an emergency. I believe in what they serve and that there are sometimes they are a safe space for someone. And I think those are important. But at the same time, I can also appreciate how they're not going to end homelessness.
We wanted to do that. We still do want to do that, especially up in the Northwest Territories, build whole communities. But we want to add one element to that, and that's a community center in the center. And this isn't a new idea. We don't think we came up with this, but the reason is exactly for what you're talking about: support. Not just throw someone in a house because they need housing, but again, program and support and ongoing support and support that's accessible to everybody, whether you can run 10 miles in an hour or it takes you 10 minutes to get to the fridge. Everybody should have full access to that kind of support. And that's why we really do want to build those kinds of large communities where you got maybe a dozen, 2 dozen homes in a circle or a square, where the center is a park and community center with full-time staff. And I wouldn't know how that looked, but full-time staff to manage the facility. And then it's, someone with some psychological background, or counselor, 1 or 2 counselors that are just there all the time. That, in downtime, they go visit people, and they're just always there for any of these people in these situations to then go visit, because we got to face it, the people that are in these communities are ones that are going to need the most help.
That's a hybrid of supportive housing and housing first. So housing first means exactly what it sounds like, except that it doesn't actually attach all the other caveats to that type of policy of thought and that type of policy of practice, which is if the home is the first barrier to someone being able to get a job, to be able to get mail, to get the certain services, to get themselves a bank account, et cetera, to get a bus pass, et cetera, all those different pieces that for whatever reason a home might be the barrier, then once you put them in that place, you're able to start triangulating all those services into one space and pushing that in the right direction to instantaneously improve this person's quality of life. Where supportive housing is sort of why you're going. And you look at it, the models that exist, they exist in Calgary, they exist in Brockville. We just went through this. Isolation shelters, which were hotels for homes, where during the COVID initial breakout, you had a number of places that were opening up and they were taking people off the street because we had to shelter in place. Now, though that's an expensive process to run, maybe it can be run differently. There are different versions of models, but what we do know categorically is those who were using that space to isolate, where they had their own individual room and space, and they had access to support services on site. Like I said, we could probably do this differently. Maybe it doesn't have to be as expensive as it looks. It might be just a matter of understanding what different models exist and sort of pulling best practices from each. But quite frankly, we know that the quality of life for the person you're serving, mathematically, we know it was better. So yeah, when you think about portable homes and tiny homes and such, and you think to yourself that a community center where people can eat together, where people can have their counseling appointments and make sure that they're learning those life skills that you're speaking of. I think of places like Indwell and Hamilton, they do the most incredible tiny, or I should say modular homes I've ever seen when it comes to the supportive aspect and building communities. And it can look different for each place. And no doubt, not only is there not one size fits all to this, but the idea that a small, tiny micro home, whichever place we want to go with it, whether it's the portable, whether it's the micro apartment, whether it's the individualized space, or whether it's building those adjacent communities, as I said, there's an option here where I believe this needs to be factored into that conversation. Mm-hmm. And more importantly, it needs to be now. While there's no doubt that there's these best practices to borrow from and we can be evaluating, we can be doing that as we're creating that change, as opposed to just talking about change for the next 10 years, waiting for something to happen.
For us, it really is about putting people in homes. We can build I have a 472 square foot design right now, and it's got a slanted roof where it's 12 foot high at the top and 10 foot ceiling on the low end. And I can do visual walkthroughs and fly-throughs. And I put windows at the 12-foot height. I put 2 foot, foot and a half deep windows all the way across the top so that it all looks up to the sky. And then windows across the bottom, a window across the bottom. What you get is this really nice flow through of light. I have obviously never been in the building myself, but in the walkthrough, it does not feel like a tiny home, but it's less than 500 square feet. And I think that's where we're going to make the win. Make a tiny home feel like a bungalow or better, and really all you got to do is put in some curved walls, put in lots of windows frickin' everywhere. Anywhere that doesn't need support of a wall, make it a window, and make the ceilings really high. Because you don't have as many limits on how high the ceiling is going to go depending on what community you're in, I guess. But so making them aesthetic like that.
Tiny Home Alliance Canada is going to be watching intently. We're excited for anyone who wants to bring innovation forward. That sounds like something that I would want to watch happen. And more importantly, I can see the benefit. There's no doubt that we're always eager to listen and always eager to partner. And more importantly, we're also eager as a professional association to find other people who might be willing to partner as well. Like I said, I think of, just down the road is that Bell Park I keep mentioning, and my goodness, if all those checks and balances were in place now, what a difference it would make for people. So no doubt. I mean, it's on our radar, and there's nothing stopping us from working together.
You're really doing a lot just for humanity's sake, and we need, right up there with Elon Musk to me, man. He's a hero of mine because he does a lot of things just for humanity's sake.
You and I are allowed to disagree on that one. I respect anyone who's that entrepreneurial and that visionary. I just sometimes wish he'd stop his damn Twitter, but that's just me.
But it's not about Elon so much as about what is he doing. Okay, he's really is doing whatever he can to move humanity forward, and whatever he can means that he's not afraid of failure. He's not afraid. He wasn't afraid of spending billions of dollars and then going broke and losing 2 companies just to see if he could do it. I'm at least going to be one person who's going to move humanity forward, because that would make me feel proud. That would make me feel good as a person.
You already are. This conversation has been evidence of that. I like to think I dedicate a lot of my time to, trying to be the best version of myself as well. And I fall down and I do some dumb shit, man. But, at the same time, I think at this moment in history, today, I'm okay. And, today I think I'm better than I've been. And I think a lot of it is because you're willing to open your mind and adapt to new concepts and philosophies. Never walk into a room assuming that because of your experiences or your background that you're the smartest person there.
Oh, gosh.
It's been the best experience of my life is sometimes being the dumbest person in the room and just saying, pour it into me and let me see how I can walk away from it.
Yeah.
When Terry Lee first started talking to me about tiny homes, I was still learning and not entirely understanding. By falling into a board and then falling into a role as a national organization that put me into a figurehead position, my education has been, significant and swift. And in doing so, I'm grateful because I feel as though I'm a better person and better advocate today than I was 3 years ago when I sat there and listened to her tell me about it. So there's no doubt in my mind that, the steps, there's no such thing as an overnight success. I always think Alexis on Fire would be my example here. I'm a punk rocker. I'm a musician. That's my thing.
I'm a singer. I'm a metalhead. I play in a metal band.
I can send you music for this episode. You let me know.
Okay.
I remember watching them do some post on their social media when they won Best New Artist at the Juno Awards, and it was in Ottawa. And they said, we really are grateful for this exposure, but we do also think it's kind of comical to be considered a new artist after 12 years of making music. They said, so to all the folks who'll be watching us at the Scotiabank Center or Arena or whatever the hell it's called out there in Canada, beautiful space where the Senators play, they said, as cool as this is, we also want to thank everyone who saw us at the Babylon, all 50 of you, at the Club Shaw, all 30 of you, at the Capitol Music Hall, all 120 of you. And they said, and all the people who lent us toothbrushes and bought us food and gave us a place to stay when we were busy trying our best to become an overnight sensation. And I like to think that that's the mantra that a lot of us should sort of adopt. And it sounds like it's sort of the direction that you're going as well. You see, I listen to what you're saying, and I think to myself, this is an invisible people story waiting to happen. Here's a guy who's lifted himself out of his circumstances and with the goal of creating something. And I think that we should encourage more people to do so. And that's where things like basic income conversations make sense, because how many people are, working suppressed wages, 3 or 4 jobs, and they have something inside of them, but they don't have the opportunity, thanks to the Spotifys of the world, to go out and make a living as a musician anymore. It's just not that simple. you think of all these different folks who bring something different to the world, I can honestly say I'm still discovering my talents. I'm 33. Some might consider that a late bloomer. Not so much. I'm actually quite confident that who I am today versus who I was a year ago versus before that and before that, geez, if things hadn't worked out 18 years ago, if I had decided to go on a different path when I was homeless myself, if there weren't people like the David Dargys in the world who looked up, who brought the best out of me and encouraged me and said, Leigh, you've got something here. You've got a talent. You can speak, you can connect, you can communicate, you can build. If it wasn't for every shitty band I was in that almost got booed off the stage that taught me humility.
Right.
At this point, I look at it and I think, well, let's go back to the housing and homelessness conversation. Right now, after 10 years of counsel, I've been beating my head off a wall trying to have these discussions with some of my colleagues who I respect. They just come from a different world than I do. And all of a sudden right now, those conversations have some substance and some meaning to them in a way they didn't before.
That's awesome.
All because you didn't just give up when things kind of weren't the way you wanted them to go.
So you don't look at yourself as a late bloomer. Instead, look at yourself as a constant bloomer.
Ah, I like that.
Huh? There's no such thing as a late bloomer. It's just somebody that blooms over again. Most flowers don't just bloom once. I'm going to switch directions on you really quickly here a little bit because this is a 3D print the future show. I want to get, we barely talked about it and for good reason. I mean, the conversation around what this technology can do to solve a lot of the challenges that we're talking about is just, it's so prominent that it's so worth talking about. But we're kind of coming to the end of the show here, and I want to wax philosophical a little bit, or maybe just go and have some good fun. How much do you know about 3D printing or the technology? Is it something that you've ever been involved in? This is kind of a lead up question, but
So my band has some 3D printed keychains. I've paid attention to the anti-gun activists out there who seem to think that 3D guns are going to be a problem.
Not gonna
I hear about 3D printing. I know of a few local folks who utilize it, and what they create is pretty spectacular. But I admit that it's still something that is somewhat outside my periphery. So I'm looking forward to this education.
So what was your opinion then? So
I remember being intimidated by it, and I'll tell you exactly why. Yeah. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's negative, but I look at any level of significant automation is going to end up in somebody's job loss. Like when you look at how when you create efficiencies, sometimes the way things have been versus, we were just having a conversation about Samsung. It's a great example before this episode started. I mean, who would have thought? I know when I was in high school, I would have never pictured in my life that I'd be talking to somebody in Alberta and I could see them. I thought that was a Star Trek concept.
True that, right?
So, yeah. If I was a cable company, I'd be terrified of Samsung, right?
Yeah,
so if I'm a home builder who has, and not to say this is a bad or a good thing, but just bear with me.
Yeah.
If I was a home builder and I was hearing that you could build tiny homes using 3D printing technology, first I'd be curious. Second, I'd look at how can I adapt? This might be innovative. What can I do? But there'd also be somewhere in there some level of apprehension that just goes, oh, my bottom line, this is going to change things. But maybe it changes things for the better. Maybe it's one of those opportunities where you go, oh my goodness, this is not only more efficient, but this is a technology I can invest in and I can create 5 times as many homes. So even if they're less price, I'm still making a significant contribution and can keep myself afloat. But if I'm not so willing to adapt and change, and coming from a punk rock ethos, I was just listening to Joe Strummer on vinyl a few minutes ago. There's the Johnny shitheads of the world from DOA who were more than willing to adapt and create their own labels and do the hard work and change as they had to. There's a lot of other folks who get stuck in a particular formula, and this could spell the end of their contributions to the housing world. So I'm curious. I'm definitely impressed. I'm anxious about it. I want to see it. Show me.
We have actually dived deep into that concept because we know that as far as our industry and people we're going to be working within the industry, we're not talking about the public, our clients, we're not talking about the government anymore. We're talking about all this in betweens, our coworkers, the people that we're going to be, other companies we're working with. And we don't see any true job loss at all. Actually, we see nothing but job gains because the real fact is that 3D printed construction is not going to take the construction industry by storm. Overnight success in this case is going to take 25, 30 years. We're 5 years in, we're doing really good. And you're right. The companies that are able to adapt with the transition, for example, Abbey Homes out here, would be really smart to wait for a company such as ours to start printing homes and be approved for the construction, and then go buy a bunch of printers and use it as one of their solutions. So now they build brick and mortar house and they 3D print. Some of those companies in another 50 years may transition straight to 3D printing. But I think housing in 100 years or 200 years or 500 years, while 3D printing is going to probably uh, be like just the way we build things, whether it's 3D printing in carbon fiber or concrete, by then, who knows? Houses, brick and mortar, I think, are still going to be a thing.
Definitely. Oh, yeah, of course. Mhm.
It'll, instead of the 3D home being a novelty, in 500 years, it'll be like you'll be driving through the country and see this old farmhouse and go, wow, remember those?
No Kindle will ever replace my love for going and buying a book from a
Yeah.
secondhand store, or, like,
Exactly. And there's always that nostalgia that comes along with it. So,
of course.
and it's that fact, just looking at saying, well, they're never really going to disappear. So the people that don't adapt, they're kind of just shooting themselves in the foot. And I can't feel bad about them. I can't have sympathy for them, because if they're choosing not to adapt, if their choice is to be angry and afraid, then I can't help them. But if their choice is to adapt and learn, well, then we can help them. We can even partner with them. 3D PHC, for sure, I know we are very open to working with anybody else that's willing to solve the problem. For the old industry going out, to be afraid of the new industry coming in is just simply a mistake. It's a poor way to look at things. And so my answer to that is it's not going to happen anyways. We are going to add jobs because we're going to add technical jobs. A guy that can wield a hammer and put up drywall isn't necessarily going to know how to run G code on an iPad. But a guy who's never been in construction before might be able to do that. So he can't find a job in his tech industry, but now suddenly we've got a new industry that can take his tech skills and put him on a job site. We're adding jobs from other industries and not taking jobs away from these industries.
No doubt I can appreciate that apprehension, but it's also because to me it's something that's so outside of my world. Whereas as we're having a conversation across the country without a long distance plan, without having an internet dial-up in the background, when something becomes more and more a part of your world, it's not so hard to imagine.
No,
So
you're right about that. Yeah.
Me, I want to see it.
Me too. Me too. The only models I've done so far, I've printed on I've got a 3D printer at home here. So, and I print my designs up so I can see how they fit together, and they kind of move around and stuff. But man, I would love to stand next to a 3D printed anything construction wise, anything. All of my experience has been all like university papers and YouTube channels that, like Jarrett Gross and them, they actually go around to sites and they kind of look, but it's all third party stuff. So I'm with you, man. I'm right with you. I cannot wait to like look and touch and feel and see how that works and watch the machine go. And that's just going to be a brilliant, awesome, wonderful week and start of the rest of my life when we start doing that.
Tiny Home Alliance Canada, we're the the leading tiny home industry association. It's an annual membership. It depends. You can be an advocate. You can be I don't live in a tiny home, but I'm an activist, so I serve a purpose. There are individual memberships, there are group memberships, there's all sorts of different pieces, but it's obviously still in its infancy, much like yours, in that it's trying to move the needle forward because there are barriers to legislation. A tiny home on wheels is expensive for insurance. I think it's important that we all work together to some degree, because in the end, I think the one thing that we all have in common is we want to see people housed. We don't want to see them not housed, and we want people to have options. And at the moment, the only thing that really stands in front of those options, whether it's 3D printing technology, whether it's tiny homes on wheels, or whether it's square footages, is because some asshole told us that we couldn't, when in fact, there's no reason why we can't. And I think that it's a matter of changing those conversations. And I think that sometimes comes through education. Maybe that asshole isn't an asshole at all. Maybe he just needs an understanding. And if they are, well, let's be loud enough that we can't be ignored. So I'm all about it. We can talk anytime. And, maybe
Awesome.
next time we'll have to exchange some music. I still make CDs. I'm one of those guys who hasn't adapted yet.
Oh, weird. I don't even know what that is. A CD. That's something.
An elaborate coaster with artwork.
My computer doesn't even have a CD drive anymore. It's like an old car with an 8-track.
You can find me on social media too, and you can find my
hilarious.
band, Project Mantra. We do have social media too, and you can listen to our music.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I've enjoyed this, man. I'm excited to see where this goes. Honestly.
Me too. Absolutely. So we're going to end the show today on that awesome, a wonderful note. It has been just such an awesome pleasure talking with you, Leigh. Terry Leigh, if you're listening to this, thank you so much for introducing us. This has been a great conversation, and I know that it's going to go further. For everybody listening today, I want to thank you guys very much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as we did. Don't forget, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell so you can get notified when our next episode comes up. And don't forget, support tiny homes, support any initiatives for homeless. Get a hold of us on social media if you have any questions or anything we can answer for you. So thank you very much for joining us today. Thanks, Leigh. We'll talk to you later.
Thanks, boss.
3D Print the Future is sponsored by 3D PHC. Find them on the web at www.3dprintedhomescorporation.com.